What's up, sports fans? This is the Lucas Ross Sports Channel. We continue with our 2025 college football schedule preview and very early projected record series. The Ole Miss Rebels are up next. Before we go game by game and preview 2025, let's take a look back at what Ole Miss did in 2024. Here are my projections and predictions last year for the Ole Miss Rebels. My projection for this team was 10-2, and then my prediction was also the same at 10-2. Ole Miss did just a little bit under that. They went 9-3 last year in the regular season, so for Ole Miss fans, they feel like this was like a disappointing season. I gotta tell you, it was kind of up and down for Ole Miss in 2024. A lot of the games they probably should have won. They probably should have won those games, and this team was not really that far away from making the college football playoff, but their schedule pretty much wasn't that tough, to be honest, to really get into the playoff, to be honest. But overall record-wise, they went 10-3 last year. It was a good season for Ole Miss. They still won 10 games, but they would like to make it into the college football playoff at least last year. This is one of the most hyped up teams from last year's season in 2024 because of all them transfers they had coming in and also all the expectations they had coming in, and with Jackson Dart coming back at quarterback. This was the schedule from last year, though, for Ole Miss in 2024. Again, their record was 9-3 in the regular season. And you look at this schedule, first off, you look at who they played in the non-conference. They played Furman, Middle Tennessee, on the road at Wake Forest, and then, of course, they also played, another non-conference team in Georgia Southern. So they started with those non-conference games pretty much in the first 4 weeks. And then once they got into SEC play, look at their home schedule. They played Kentucky, Oklahoma, Georgia, and Mississippi State. So they lost to Kentucky. That was probably the biggest loss there that Ole Miss had on this schedule from last year in 2024. Kentucky definitely probably cost Ole Miss a pretty much, a playoff spot. After that loss and everything, Ole Miss probably was just out of the college football playoff. LSU on the road, or I should say, let's go to the road schedule. They played South Carolina on the road, LSU, Arkansas, Florida. That was their road schedule last year in the SEC. South Carolina, they defeated them. South Carolina ended up being a pretty good team last year. LSU obviously was kind of maybe an up and down team. I wouldn't really say they were disappointing, but they were just decent. That's all I can say. But Ole Miss, they controlled that game for the most part. They lost to LSU, though, on the road, and then they beat Arkansas, but then lost to Florida here on the road. That's probably the game that cost Ole Miss a playoff spot. I think Florida probably ruined Ole Miss's playoff chances, but I think that Kentucky game is pretty much the start of the downfall of the losses there for Ole Miss. But yeah, that was the schedule from last year in 2024. Let's now look ahead to 2025. This is the schedule for Ole Miss coming up for the 2025 season. Before we go game by game, let's take a look at who Ole Miss will play in the non-conference for this season. So this is their non-conference schedule. They will play Georgia State, Tulane, Washington State, and the Seidels. So you look at this non-conference schedule, you only got really easy win here. The Seidel, that's an FCS team. Georgia State and Tulane, I feel like, are not going to be too easy games for Ole Miss, but they'll still be big favorites in both of those games. Georgia State is not a bad team out of the Sun Belt. Tulane, was really good, for the last couple years, but last year they had a new head coach, but they were still pretty decent as a Group of 5 team as well. So a couple of Group of 5 teams, and then you got Washington State here, a former Power 5 team here in the non-conference as well. That'll be a pretty interesting non-conference game right there. Washington State, they were actually pretty good last year, so this definitely probably won't be an easy game either in a non-conference. So yeah, the non-conference schedule I feel like is a little bit tougher compared to last year, but Ole Miss probably will be favored in all 4 of these games in the non-conference if I'm not mistaken, and they're all at home, so Ole Miss definitely should be able to take care of business. I think Washington State, though, will be definitely tougher than Tulane and Georgia State. Let's go to their home SEC schedule now. They'll play 4 home games in the SEC. They'll play Arkansas, LSU, South Carolina, and Florida. So they get all 4 of these teams at home. What jumps out to me about this home SEC schedule is that you get LSU and Florida both at home this year. Those are two teams that you lost to last year if you're Ole Miss. Those two games will be revenge games. They play LSU a little bit earlier in the year, and then they play Florida, later in the season like they did last year. So it kind of gives Ole Miss some time, to kind of figure things out, what they did, wrong to these two teams from last year. Arkansas and South Carolina, I don't really know how good Arkansas is going to be. South Carolina definitely could be a pretty tough one there at home. So yeah, that's your home SEC schedule. Let's now move on to the away schedule here in the SEC. They'll play 4 road games in the SEC. They'll play Kentucky on the road, Georgia, Oklahoma, and Mississippi State. So they're going to be playing Georgia on the road. They beat Georgia last year, of course. That will be a revenge game there for the Bulldogs, but that's a very tough place to play. Oklahoma definitely the same way. Oklahoma was pretty average last year, but they kind of gave Ole Miss some problems, especially on the defensive side of the football. Mississippi State you play every year because of the Egg Bowl, but you look at Kentucky, that's a team that you lost to last year. Even if it's on the road, that's a revenge game there for Ole Miss. So this road schedule, it's not too bad. It could be a lot worse if you had to play either, Florida or South Carolina both on the road. But yeah, Georgia and Oklahoma, I think, are definitely your two toughest road games. The Oklahoma game definitely could be a trap one, and, Kentucky also could be a trap game as well. Let's now go back to the schedule here and go full game by game now. Again, they start things off with Georgia State on August 30th, and then they open up SEC play here rather early on the road at Kentucky on September the 6th. Again, Kentucky was a team that they lost to last year, and Kentucky ended up not being really good the rest of the way. You look at Arkansas, they'll play them next here at home on September 13th, and then they'll play Tulane after that here on September 20th. Then it's LSU at home on September 27th, another one of those revenge games there for Ole Miss here in the month of September. And then their first bye week actually comes right before Washington State. They'll play the Cougars here on October the 12th, and then it's on the road at Georgia on October 18th. And then they go also on the road at Oklahoma on October 25th. So you got back-to-back road games there with Georgia and Oklahoma. Two pretty physical teams with two really good defenses. Yeah, those are really tough back-to-back road games in my opinion for Ole Miss. And then after that, it's South Carolina at home on November 1st. Then they'll play FCS team the Seidel here on November 8th. Then they play Florida at home on November 15th, another one of those revenge games here for the Rebels. And then they have another bye week before they close things out with the Egg Bowl on the road at Mississippi State on November 29th. So you look at this schedule here, it's not really too tough compared to last year in my opinion. I really shouldn't say last year, but they do play Georgia and Oklahoma both on the road. Again, in my opinion, those are your really two toughest road games on this schedule. Kentucky, obviously a trap game. Mississippi State, the Egg Bowl, it seems like it's always every year that they have a pretty good game. Last year's game was not really that close, though. Ole Miss definitely has been the better team as of late here in this rivalry. But yeah, this schedule, it's not too bad. It could be a lot worse here for the Rebels, but let's now get to the projection here for Ole Miss for 2025. This is the scale I have been using here for my projections. Again, it's a 1% game in the red. That's counted as an automatic loss in that percentage. 20% games in the orange are games where Ole Miss will be a double-digit underdog by 10 to 14 points. 40% games in the yellow are going to be games where Ole Miss will be a clear underdog game by about a touchdown, 6 or 7 points, somewhere in that range. 50-50 games, of course, will stay in the white, games that really can go either way. 60% games in the purple will be games where Ole Miss will be favored by about a touchdown, just like the yellow. They'll be favored by 6 or 7 points in that percentage. 80% games in the blue, just like the orange. Those are games where Ole Miss will be favored by double digits, 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that range. And then your 99% games here in the green, that's your automatic wins. Just like the red games, those are your automatic wins, not guaranteed wins, and same thing with the red, not guaranteed losses. But we count them as wins and losses here in this projection. But we'll start with that percentage here first for Ole Miss, the easy wins here on this schedule for 2025. I think you got 3 easy wins: Georgia State, Tulane, and the Seidel. I think they'll be big favorites here against the Seidel. That game is definitely over 95%. Tulane and Georgia State, you can probably make an argument that both of those games should be in the blue, but I'm going to stick with them and put them in the green for right now, just because they're both at home. These games probably could be at least at 90%, and Tulane also could be at 90%, but it would be like not a big shock if Ole Miss were to lose one of these two games. Georgia State, like I said, is known for pulling off upsets as a Sun Belt team. Tulane pretty much is a well-coached team. I mean, I can really see both of these games being like, potential losses here for Ole Miss, but I don't really think they'll lose any of those games. It would be a big shock probably if they did lose, probably one of these two games. But either way, I think Ole Miss will be clear favorites in all three of these games. They definitely should be able to take care of business. So those are your automatic wins. Let's now go to the blue games where I think Ole Miss will be favored by double digits, 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that particular range. I got a couple of them on here, Arkansas and Mississippi State on the road. Again, I don't really know how good Arkansas is going to be this year. They were pretty good last year, but, Arkansas just pretty much finished the season like pretty average. If this game was on the road at Arkansas, I definitely would put it in the purple. But last year's game was not really close between these two teams, so I'm going to put it in the blue for right now just because Ole Miss is playing at home. And then Mississippi State on the road, I get it. That game should be in the purple as well. It's a rivalry game. Anything can happen, but Mississippi State wasn't really good last year, and I don't know how good this team is going to be this year either. So I think Ole Miss will be favored by double digits in both of those games. Again, by a couple of touchdowns, 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that particular range. Let's now go to the purple games where I think Ole Miss will be favored by 6 or 7 points, so by about a touchdown at least. I got about 3 of them on here. Kentucky on the road, Washington State, and then Oklahoma on the road. I think Ole Miss will be 6 or 7 point favorites in all 3 of these games. Kentucky, because they beat Ole Miss last year, that's a purple game in my opinion. I think Ole Miss will be favored by 6 or 7 points, and it's early in the season, so we don't really know much about these teams until we get into about week 5 or week 6 perhaps. You kind of need like 4 weeks to kind of figure out what these teams are going to look like. And again, that Kentucky game, because they lost to them last year, that's the reason why it's in the purple, and plus playing on the road, that's also the reason why it's in the purple. Washington State, pretty interesting non-conference game like I keep mentioning. That really could be a tricky game there for Ole Miss. And, Notre Dame has a non-conference game against Boise State. It's kind of similar to that. We don't really know how good Washington State and Boise State will be because we don't really study Group of 5 teams that much, and same thing with the former Power 5 teams in Washington State and Oregon State. So I think Ole Miss, though, playing at home, they'll be favored in that game by 6 or 7 points. And then Oklahoma, pretty average team last year. I think Ole Miss will be a 6 or 7 point favorite, even on the road at Oklahoma. It's a game that really, I think the Rebels will be, favored and everything. But I would not be surprised if Oklahoma definitely pulled off the upset here. So these 3 games, again, I think Ole Miss will be favored in all 3 of them by 6 or 7 points. And then that leaves you with 4 50-50 games on here. LSU, Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida. So I think all 4 of these games are 50-50 games. They really can go either way. LSU, because they beat Ole Miss last year, that's the reason why it's a 50-50 game. Georgia on the road, pretty tough place to play. I know Ole Miss beat Georgia last year. If it was at home this year for the Rebels, I probably would put Georgia as an underdog by 6 or 7 points, but because it's on the road, I'm going to put it in the white for right now. South Carolina and Florida, Florida beat Ole Miss last year. That's the reason why it's a 50-50 game. And South Carolina, just the way they finished last year, that's a pretty tough one to call. So I got all 4 of these games as 50-50 games. So you split these 50-50 games. Let's say they win 2 out of the 4 50-50 games as we get into the projected record here. Again, we count the green games as wins, the blue games as wins as well. You average out these purple games at 60%, and like I said, you split those 50-50 games. I think they win at least 2 out of the 4 50-50 games here because you got 4 total 50-50 games. That's how you split it, and that gives you a projected record of 10-2 here for Ole Miss. So that is what the projection looks like here for the Rebels for 2025 based on how tough this schedule is, and again, based off of you split those 50-50 games. Again, let's say they lose to LSU and Georgia on the road. That's going to give you 2 losses, but let's say they beat South Carolina and Florida, and then they win the rest of their games here in the purple, to be honest, and then also you count the green and blue games as wins. That's going to give you 10 wins there for Ole Miss. So that's how the projection came out to be 10 10-2. But I would not be surprised if Ole Miss probably slips up in one of these purple games. I think worst case scenario probably has to be 9-3 again, and then best case probably 11-1. But I'm going with the same projection as last year here for Ole Miss at 10-2 here for 2025. Do you guys agree or disagree? Give me your thoughts about Ole Miss down in the comments below. And also, do you think their schedule is pretty tough for 2025 or not so tough? Thanks for watching this video, and stay tuned for more sports content videos on my Lucas Ross Sports YouTube channel.